Hello, can you hear me? I think I'm on. All right, let's get started. Uh, this feels very odd with the table. I don't. Yeah. All right. It is what it is. We're doing it. Okay. Tonight we're going to be talking about contextualization, and to start with, probably the best place to go with that is at some point, somebody, me almost for certain, and probably somebody else, is going to say something that offends you, that bothers you, that hits at some part of you, and it just will rub it the wrong way. Because it's very difficult to talk about culture and to talk about how the Bible engages with culture without doing that. So when that happens, it was me. Come back to like, okay, well, just because it brings up that feeling of pushing back, of like hitting you and hitting something that kind of hurts, doesn't mean that it's wrong. Could be right. Maybe that is the Holy Spirit challenging you. Maybe it is the wisdom of the community challenging you. And even if it's not, let's say that it is wrong, right? It can still be important, right? Just when somebody gives you feedback. I remember there was this, when I was doing student ministry, my boss at the time came to listen to a talk that I gave to the kids, sat on the back of the room the whole time and was either on her phone or talking to the person next to her. And then the next day said, hey, I didn't understand your talk. From now on, I want you to review all of them with me before you give them. I was like, well, you have to pay attention to like follow it, right? So the criticism was not valid, but the process that came out of me going along with it anyways and like having better preparation ended up being really good for me. So that's like even if it's not okay, or even if it ends up being wrong, it can still be important just as we walk through that. Does that make sense? All right, cool. So let's start then with when we talk about contextualization, what are we not talking about? And, I'm not on the clicky thing. Click on the clicky thing. We're not talking about syncretism, okay? Who knows what syncretism is? Yeah, Wes. Well, yeah, sorry, no, it was not just, right. Yeah, right.
Things from other, like from outside of, let's say, Christianity, and like mixing it in with it.
Yeah.
Whether it's culture, another religion, something like that, and saying, oh, well, we'll do that. Like idols, like, oh, we'll worship idols as Christian idols or whatever.
Yep, absolutely. That's it. It can also be called acculturation or acculturation or cultural accommodation. There's this idea of like taking these differing ideas that should be differing at like a fundamental level, but then they come together, right? And kind of mixing them together to create something sort of new and dilute or change whatever's been brought to that in the process, right? Exactly. So can somebody turn to Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 31, and then somebody else do the 2 Kings, and then somebody else do Isaiah? Who wants to do the Deuteronomy? Whoever gets. All right, Tim on Deuteronomy, and then who wants to do 2 Kings? Jake? And what about Isaiah? Thanks. Yeah, go for it.
Take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? That I also may do the same. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods.
All right, so God's giving this warning to the Israelites before they go into the promised land. Like, you're going to see a bunch of stuff, and it might end up looking kind of appealing, but like, don't bring that into what I am trying to build. All right, 2 Kings. Jake?
So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods. After among whom they had been carried away. To this day they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the rules of the law or the commandment that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. The Lord made a covenant with them and commanded them. You shall not fear other gods or bow yourselves to them or serve them or sacrifice to them, but you shall fear the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and with outstretched arms. You shall bow yourselves to him, and to him you shall sacrifice. And the statutes and the rules and the law and the commandments that he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to do. You shall not fear other gods. You shall not forget the covenant that I have made with you. You shall not fear other gods, but you shall fear the Lord your God, and he will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. However, they would not listen, but they did according to their former manner. So these nations feared the Lord and also served their carved images. Their children did likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did, so they do to this day.
All right, and then Spence, if you can read the...
Yeah, and the Lord said, because this people draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment taught by men, therefore, behold, I will again do wonderful things with this people, wonder upon wonder. The wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be hidden.
So those are both getting after the same idea of like, these are not just outward expressions. Like the Israelites are claiming the name of the Lord, but then they're going and doing these other things, both at an individual and at a communal level. So that's not some sort of automatic like, oh, well, they were just serving other. No, this is talking actually about the syncretism of, oh yeah, we're Israelites. Oh, but we also sacrifice our children to Molech or whatever it is, right? We can do both, right? So when we talk about contextualization, we're not talking about syncretism. I mean, we have to like actually talk about it because that is a very real thing that happens and a very real danger. But that's not what we mean when we talk about the good side of contextualization. So what are we talking about? The part of why this is so hard to identify, though, is like, what is syncretism? Is there's this joke here, if you guys could read that. The older fish in the fishbowl is like, morning boys, how's the water? And one of the younger fish turns to the other one and says, what the hell is water? Right? It can be very hard for us to identify our culture because we're just in it. We're in it. And so it's very hard to look outside of that and see what it is. So that's why, like, first talking about syncretism, because we can get there like intellectually of, oh, like, is that what you mean by contextualization? Like, no, that's not the thing. But then also how difficult this can be is because we're just in it, right? And so it can be very hard to recognize our own culture. And part of what that means is then like none of us come to the Bible, none of us come to faith contextlessly, right? We always come bringing in our culture. And even like very, very simple example. So I've been learning a little bit of German, which is like it's structurally, it's a very beautiful language. I've actually like really enjoyed it. And they do this thing where like, they have a little joiner that's made just for joining words together because German does that so much. And they're just like, oh yeah, join those two words together. And actually have this little pairing that's like, oh, they're telling you we're joining these two words together. So in German, the word for worship is a joining of the word for God and a joining of the word for work or service, right? So even just that little, like, it's the same thing. And when we translate it, we can just translate it as worship and hear the same thing. But even just that little bit of cultural context can make a huge difference then in terms of like what happens and how does faith develop and how do people talk about it, right? And something like that would be very, very difficult to recognize if you're German, growing up, speaking German, doing German things. You'd have probably no idea how that may be affecting you, just that little seemingly insignificant difference, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about what is water. So what is like good contextualization then? It is giving people God's answers to questions about life that people in their time and place are asking in languages and forms they can comprehend and through appeals and arguments they can feel. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? All right, so now we've done a little bit on like, we're not talking about syncretism, right? We're talking about contextualization. What is contextualization? So now let's start to look at American culture a little bit. What do we think are maybe some instances of syncretism in the American church? Or we could even start with, if that's a little too uncomfortable, like what are identifying features of American culture? Performance. Yeah, that's a big one.
Individual versus the community.
Yes. Yeah.
The American flag, pride in the country.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, this idea that I think the American flag displays that sort of sanctuary.
Totally. What else?
Maybe the "in God we trust" kind of.
Yeah, that's kind of it, like seemingly working in the other way, right? But nothing's ever that isolated. And so something like that is a form of syncretism. Having in God we trust on money or on any sort of public things like that.
I think of like using secular principles and like baptizing them with Christianese, like boundaries. That's one of my hobby horses is boundaries, and that like a lot of the time they can be used just for selfishness, and I feel like there's the whole boundaries in marriage, and it's great. There are definitely like places for that, but I think we can tend to like use those in our Christian environments often more than like what the Bible says about those types of things. So just like letting cultural things sort of mix in with Christian language and how we discuss anything, really, that we don't even, again, we may not even know that it's not biblical or not from the Bible, and it just
So
kind
you
of.
talking about like homeschooling and stuff like that?
I mean, sure, it could be that. Yeah, it could, because anything that becomes like a Christian value that is not something that the Bible directly tells us to do. I think that could be a great example. There are plenty of churches for whom that has become like a theological stance.
Well, I think there's even a great example in that of like, think about psychology and psychiatry, right, as a form of like, well, no, it's not that talking about things, it's not that any of the forms of therapy or even medicine for like chemical brain differences is wrong. But if we completely supplant things like prayer and community and things like that, we've taken this thing that is not necessarily bad on its own, and we've slightly shifted our faith around that to become more of a pillar, right? So it's like, yeah, not bad, but just this easy cultural takeover that can happen.
We've also seen changes in the church, like from the 50s, like a really like, women are at home and raising the kids, like that was just a very part of the culture. I think Christians navigated that, and that was, I don't know, it felt like it was kind of integrated into the church's ways too.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
Bradley's
trad-wise,
Actually cool now, how the tables have turned.
there's this really fun picture of Billy Graham. And Billy Graham was a young guy. This was like sometime in the 30s, right? And so this is Youth for Christ is like coming up. He's starting to do his revivals and things like that. And there's this picture of him where he's like leaning out past a podium and he's going like this, like making some sort of really impassioned point. But what's important about the picture is that way down here, you can see this little gap between his pants and his shoes. And he's wearing Argyle socks. Right. Which to us doesn't mean anything. But at the time that Billy Graham was getting started, that was a big deal because that was associated with like jazz and hedonism and kind of all these. So people, like religious people, were super angry and thought Billy Graham was a part of like leading people away from Christ because he was wearing Argyle socks. Okay? Like we can talk about how crazy that is, but if we were Christians in the 30s, statistically, guess where we're going to be? Hating on Billy Graham, right? For wearing Argyle socks. We just don't have that difference of 100 years of distance to be able to see more clearly what those cultural things are. Any others? But yeah.
My big thing is like the self-care turning into self-worship, and there's some good Sabbath things, but it's not worshiping yourself. And
Yeah. Eileen?
I see this like sort of soft psychology emphasis in certain circles, you know, like people who I might identify with, like following Brene Brown or like Kevin Peterson, or like I would say the Enneagram, like those can be kind of like an ideology that they join together with their faith.
Totally. Yeah. Yep. Mike?
A lot of like new age spiritualism is very big in the church today, especially in like younger millennials and Gen Z. There's a lot of that, spiritualism, like do what your spirit desires, or like pairing Enneagram or horoscopes or whatever brew not based in scripture or science, pairing it with the church.
Yeah. I think so. The one that Charlotte mentioned that I think is really important for understanding like American culture at a whole is that idea of the individualism, because I think that drives so many other things, right? So like part of the reason we're able to identify all these different like, yeah, there's a pocket who's like the New Age, and there's a pocket who's the this, and there's a pocket who's the that, is because that individualism is so deeply rooted in American culture that drives so many other things, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later too, because we'll talk about things like a culture's perspective on a thing like epistemology, like how do we know what we know, right? And so the individualism outflow in America is, well, I know because I know, right? Just kind of the driver of the self as the expert, even including determining like who else can be an expert or things like that, right? And so it's why things like subcultures can develop. But that's also that's part of why diagnosing in the American cultural context can be so difficult, is because it can be easy to look out and say like, oh, American culture is over there because I'm part of like the Christianese subculture or whatever it is, right? And that's just a different form of the underlying expression of American culture, right? So it is very insidious within our culture and makes a very difficult thing naturally even more difficult because of our context. That makes sense? All right. So we'll have some more time to talk about that in the groups, but I want to talk about like, okay, well, what do we do? So let's talk about biblical contextualization, right? And we've got exegesis versus eisegesis. Does anybody know what those two are? Taken out of and putting in. Yep, right. So exegesis is just, it's the word, it's a technical term for like, okay, how do I go and read the Bible as the Bible is meant to be read? And then eisegesis is like, how do I go and read the Bible so that I understand it and I see what's in it for me and kind of all these other things. It's like, what are you primarily going for? Are you bringing yourself into it? Or are you going there saying, how much of myself can I shed so that I see what I'm really supposed to see here? So like one of the things that can crop up here is the idea of a canon within a canon. Does anybody have a guess at what I mean by that?
Well, canon is like the story, but not what's actually written in the story. It's like something that would happen within the story, right?
Yeah, so that we think of canon as like what is bought onto in terms of the story creator, right? When we talk about it within the Bible, most often what we're talking about is like, well, how do we end up with the books and the texts that we have there today? And so what we'll do is we'll like think a lot about parts of it and not about other parts of it, right? So we think about like, in the American Christianese subculture, what the Bible has to say about sex, sure, yeah, I'm on board with like, how that speaks into the human thriving and things like that. But criticisms of consumerism or like openness to foreigners and the poor, No, I don't have to necessarily be explicitly against it, but I don't have to focus on it, right? Or maybe I'm explicitly against it because maybe I've gone all the way into this like syncretism space. But that's this idea of like canon within the canon. We can do it explicitly and we can do it implicitly too, right? We can do it very like we just end up there. Again, what is water, right? What is water to a fish? Any other questions or examples of those things you can think of?
Wait, can you?
Julian said the red letter Bible thing.
Yeah. This explicit idea that like, oh, the words of Christ carry more weight than the rest of Scripture, which is like something Jesus, like you cannot do that without coming to the conclusion that is not true, because that's literally a thing that Jesus says is like, no, all Scripture is, yeah, so.
It's actually red letter Christians, because the red
Yes.
letter Bible.
Just means it's high, so you just know, right? Yeah, right,
Yeah, there's a guy.
right.
Yes. Yeah.
Only, yeah,
So read everything.
right. Cut the rest of it out, yeah. The red only Bible, that's the, yeah, yeah.
Wait, could you go back to, and I think I might have missed it, but the exegesis versus eisegesis, how does that explain how that plays into this?
Yeah. Let's go with like a non-cultural example, and one that I think is pretty fun, right? Is like, okay, was it Jehovah's Witnesses? Or is it, so the like, oh, there's only gonna be 144,000 people in heaven, right? Like, okay, great. That you can read Revelation and you can see a verse in there that talks about there's 144,000 people. Literally, the next verse is, and then I turned around and there was a countless multitude. Also in heaven, right? So, that's, if I'm reading it eisegetically, and I can pick out that verse and I'd be like, oh, that tells me the thing that I want to know, or this thing that I can grab hold on and I can take and use in these other places. But if I'm reading it with any sort of exegetical form where I'm trying to approach and understand what it's really trying to say, what God intended to say with it, I cannot read that verse that way.
And I feel like where it really comes into play is when we start taking things like spare the rod, spoil the child, and making like hyper-focus on things like that. And
It's, yeah.
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because then it has a direct, then it's not just like this ethereal thing out there of like only 144,000. It's like a thing that has a direct impact on your household.
Well, and to bring that back around into the idea of syncretism, like the phrase, I'm imagining y'all have heard people use the phrase like blood is thicker than water, right? What is the end of that verse? We've been reading through Proverbs, right? So, the way that I was thinking of it with the specific expression of like blood is thicker than water, but a friend sticks closer than a brother. That's the proverb, right? So this idea of like, all right, now we're getting into like the syncretism and how we read eisegetically versus exegetically and all these things of like just how quickly and how easily those things move along. Do we get this little cultural heuristic that we can all hold on to and internalize to some extent because we hear it so much? But that's not what the Bible is saying, right? And again, like, okay, it's Proverbs, so that's not really like God trying to give this commanding instruction anyways. It's a piece of wisdom literature, but still, then we treat it as something else culturally, right? Hmm.
And there are scenes of Jesus being really angry. But if you like were to like make columns, like these are the feelings that Jesus was feeling in all of his interactions with everybody outside of his disciples, that would be such a short minority that I think there are parts of Christian culture that maybe overemphasize that like we need to like tell the culture what they need to hear. We need to be flipping tables and whipping people in the temple. And it's like that's such a, I think, out of proportion view of Jesus.
Yes.
You can go the opposite direction too, of just the Jesus who, is never gets.
He didn't cast a stone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Literally, it's like, I could condemn you, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay. There is John Stott, if you've heard the name. He has this idea for reading the Bible called I think it's the bridge model. And if I'm describing this correctly, it's like, okay, the Bible is over here, and our culture here today is over here, right? And when we read the Bible exegetically, our idea is how can I go back and read it the way it was framed originally so that it can apply to where I am today, right? God wrote it within that context. God inspired it within that context and knew that I was going to be sitting here reading it thousands of years later, right? So it has to be able to apply. But an important thing about that is like both sides are not equal because, again, we're avoiding syncretism, right? So what happens is you like, okay, I start at my culture, I go back over and I read. I've crossed the bridge, I'm reading the Bible, and now I like go back to my culture and I look at it and I have what the Bible had. Oh, okay, so I got to keep going back across and keep going back to the Bible because they don't hold equal weight. And so how are we moving across that bridge? How are we being moved across that bridge without saying that like our culture is equal to the Bible? Because that can't be. If our culture is equal to the Bible, then our culture is supreme because it will always have things that disagree or go against the Bible, right? The Bible is always going to have things that critique culture because God is against, in some form, every culture that has ever been established. He's also in and inspired every culture that's ever been established. All right. Yep. Hermeneutical spiral is what that can be called. Like, how do we keep going back and learning and reading exegetically instead of eisegetically? Oh, I forgot I had Gottesdienst in here. That's it. That's the German word. Little es joiner is what's you have Gott, which is the German word for God, and then this is like work or service. And the S is just telling you like, hey, we're joining two words together. German. It's so fun. All right. So if we can't approach it culturalistly, like how do we do this well? So biblical contextualization is like how do I read and learn well so that I'm seeing what God intended to tell me with the Bible and trying to reduce how much my culture informs it. Active contextualization is where we then turn the corner and say, now how do I transmit this gospel truth back out into this culture that I'm engaging with, right? How do I understand the culture so that I can communicate it in ways where, again, the Bible's answers haven't changed, but I'm communicating in forms that the culture can understand. I think it's like a 1950s movie called The African Queen with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. And Katharine Hepburn is a missionary, and she goes like deep into Africa, right? I think up the Congo River. No, they're on the east side, so I don't know what the river is. Anyhow, there's this scene in the movie where they've built this pavilion to have a church service, and there's a guy playing the organ, and all the Africans are just like bored out of their minds and talking and kind of doing all these things, right? You think, oh, they traipsed this organ like 1,000 miles into the African wilderness to then bore these people that they're trying to minister to, right? So that has always served for me as the picture of like, oh, there's no contextualization going on, right? Hopefully they're holding a true gospel message, but they're not communicating in a way that the people they're trying to reach are going to hear or understand or care about because it's completely culturally blind. They're bringing their culture in and saying, yeah, this is what church looks like. This is what worshiping God looks like, right? But it's not at all. So when we do active contextualization, right, this is where we start to understand and diagnose our culture better. This is the idea of like critical enjoyment. How do we see our culture honestly as it is and appreciate what is beautiful and wonderful and God-inspired about it? And an easy way to help think about these is like A beliefs. What are the A beliefs in the culture that are helpful and like God or gospel reflecting? So an example of an A belief, of a God or gospel reflecting belief in American culture would be?
Helping your neighbor after a disaster.
Yeah, right? What else? Being kind.
All men are created equal.
All men are created equal, right? So probably the most identifying feature that we talked about earlier that can go real bad for American culture, hyper-individualism. Individuals are extremely important to God. You as an individual are extremely important to God, right? So counter that with like a communal culture, right? A lot of like Asian cultures and things like that where the family or the state or things like that, like, okay, the individual matters, right?
You could actually say that like the Bible started that from the very communal, like hierarchical culture
Yes.
in, you know, with even the women who followed Jesus and like Rahab and, you know, the individuals that God, you know, pointed to and lifted up that would not have been.
He didn't just talk about churches, he pointed out specifically.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So there are always going to be things in a culture, and like turning it back around the other way of, well, people who come from communal cultures are going to have a much better understanding of things like authority, right? And, oh, well, why do I place myself under, say, the authority of the church or the authority of God as king if I don't feel or understand that deeply myself? Well, somebody who comes from a communal, either a family or a state-based culture, like a bigger culture or a bigger communal-based culture, is going to have a much easier time being like, oh yeah, God is king. I totally get that. Or somebody who lives in a monarchy. Like, oh, I understand what it means for somebody to be king. I understand what it means for somebody to have authority when I don't understand or agree with it, right? Whereas we will struggle with that. So that gets us into these idea of B beliefs, which are like, what are things in the culture that will grate up against the gospel, that will grate up against God's character? And they're going to, again, both of these things, A beliefs, like the gospel reflecting beliefs, and the B beliefs, beliefs which the gospel will confront or convict on, are going to be present in every single culture. We talked a lot about our B beliefs in American culture.
You'd be like, we know best, or I know best, I know better, God, we know better than God.
Totally, yeah, right. I know, I get to determine, right? And so if I don't agree with that, like, maybe it's not true, maybe that wasn't, I'll find whatever way to rationalize it.
Would the A and B beliefs, could you also look at that as, and I can't remember whether this is, if I'm remembering it correctly, but almost like two sides of the same coin? So like, if we're talking about individualism, the A belief would be the individual matters.
Yes.
The B belief would be my spirituality and, my relationship with God matters more than the communal, like,
Yeah, if the community disagrees with me about something, the community must be wrong, right?
Because God cares for him.
Right,
Right.
exactly,
So it'd be
yeah.
like, here's the good thing, but and the B is like how it has sort of become unbiblical in a sense, or how it's been twisted. Maybe.
Yeah, which goes back to like, what are cultures doing? Cultures are formations from people, and we're just creating idols, right? So we take a good thing, we take the fact that the individual matters to God, and we like, oh, well, our culture has to be based on something. Let's pump that up to like 200 or whatever, right? What does that look like? That looks like now, right? So yeah, it'll very often be like the things that are not always, but almost always, the things that are gospel reflecting in the culture will have a dark underside of like, oh, where does that go wrong when we give ourselves over to it? All right, so when we've done this work of diagnosis, right, of like seeing and understanding our culture, understanding what's in the culture that is gospel reflective and that is challenged by it, then when we think about how do we communicate the gospel within that context, right? And whatever that looks like, there's going to be consistent pieces of a gospel message, of like a functional gospel communication, right? We're going to have this idea of epistemological challenge. Well, okay, how do we know that the things that our culture holds up as true, the things that you as an individual hold are true? How do you know that those are the things that are true, right? This is one that is incredibly difficult in our culture because of the hyper-individualism, right? Like this base challenge of, I know because I know. I get to decide, right? This is a very difficult context for this. Two is the personal challenge, right? So like, okay, what is your intersection with the brokenness of the world, the brokenness of mankind in the context of the gospel, right? What part do you play in all of this? And then lastly is the proclamation of Christ. Like, where is Christ the bridge from what is wrong with the world, what is wrong with me, and then, what's wrong with everything that I see that is those two things, okay? So it'll be packaged differently because, again, we want to speak in the forms that are present, right? If we're doing inner city ministry, it's going to look very different than if we're doing rural ministry or things like that, right? But these elements, in terms of if we're having a conversation with an individual that is tailored to their context, we can look at it like what we're thinking, like, oh, are these elements present? Like, okay, great, right? Now, if you've done a really good job of like diagnosing and understanding your culture, and you know people really well, you can probably have a free-flowing conversation where you're not actively thinking about these things. But it's helpful to have walked through them beforehand and have that sitting in the back of your mind, and especially if you walk into a new cultural context. Like if any of you go down to the Bahamas with us, right? Like thinking through, oh yeah, it's different. It is different. It may seem the same, but it's different, right? All right. So now we're going to go to discussion. Got some questions here. I'll hand them out. Any questions?
Just briefly.
Yeah.
When you said the personal challenge, so is that if you are speaking to someone, you are challenging that person personally to think about the part that they play, or is that, like, how does that?
Yeah, not
play out?
not necessarily, right? Because again, we want that to be culturally informed, right? So there's this story that I think, I can't remember who told it originally. I think I picked it up from Tim Keller, where there was a missionary who was ministering to prostitutes in like Thailand or something like that, right? And so they couldn't get on board with this concept of like God loving them enough to forgive them and look past what they had done. But when the missionary started framing it as, well, like God is a king, he can just decree that he gets to decide what all the laws are, right? And he can just decide this. That resonated because they're familiar with the concepts of monarchy and how a king can just decide what is, right? So that personal challenge may not actually be personal. It's going to be contextualized to some extent. It's really just the turn of where is the individual impacting and intersecting with this. So think of like the epistemological challenge as like the cultural challenge. How do I create a little bit of distance between the individual and their culture for them just to like see, oh my gosh, I'm in a bowl of water, right? I don't even know if it's warm or what it is or any of these things, but I'm in a bowl of water. And then the personal challenge is, I'm a fish. I'm a fish. I'm a fish, right? So, like personal challenge, that maybe the words could be a little bit different because that is a little too leading. But that's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.